Hello, welcome to the extra credits of Brady Corbet's The Brutalist. I'm Trey.
And I'm Kelsi.
So, The Brutalist. This has been the most anticipated movie of the last 6 to 8 months.
Yeah.
A movie that came out of Venice with the Silver Lion, so it's been a big deal since, I think, August. And basically every critic going across like November to December who was able to check out this movie early, because apparently it was only playing in New York and LA the past few months. Now it just got to us here in Colorado in January. But basically every critic was like, this movie is all caps monumental.
Yeah.
To the point where they like made a joke about it on the poster where they said like 15 critics had said this movie is monumental. And, people have discussed this film, even those who are critical of it, as this towering cinematic achievement. So I did not go into January expecting we would still be talking about or discussing movies that others are identifying as a masterpiece from 2024, but here we are. We just finished our deep dive on Queer, which is one of my favorite movies of the year. That is a distancing movie, but quite an achievement. And now we're talking about a movie that some are calling, the next Godfather.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot to discuss today. This is a dense text. This is a massive movie. It's very big. It's ambitious.
Yeah.
It is bold in scope considering its budget. If you know anything about Corbet's decisions to get this movie made at a $10 million budget, or the kind of scarcity of resources around this project, about how he tried to get it off the ground for like 7 or 8 years, was shooting it for 4 or 5 years. This has been a long journey to get this movie made, and the fact that A24 is getting it out on IMAX screens is pretty amazing. It's shot on VistaVision, so there's a lot to love from a pretentious like cinephile lens of this film, but also narratively, it is a movie that we have seen before. It is like the great American tragedy. It is a coming to America nightmare. It is the American dream is a lie kind of story that we've seen in cinema, that we've seen in fiction. And it is a 215-minute movie. So a film that you would think people would hate, considering its length, considering the repetitiveness of this genre and story, though it is a story that should be retold over time for obvious reasons. But yeah, what are your first walk-away thoughts? Because we just saw it last night, so this is a reaction episode, even though we're trying to deep dive it in the moment. And so we haven't really taken in too many of our favorite other podcasts or critics' opinions on this film, so we're really kind of going off fresh reactions here. But what are your walk-away thoughts? Did you walk away thinking, was this a masterpiece? Was this 2 movies in one? Is it overrated? How are you feeling?
I think my first thought, just like takeaway from the movie, is I love an intermission. Loved the intermission.
Yeah.
We're in a packed theater.
I do too.
And not only obviously does it, like, for practical reasons, give people a minute to like do what they need to do, not miss parts of the movie, take a break, but also, I loved seeing people kind of like catch up, talk about the movie, overhear conversations of how people were receiving the movie or their thoughts, or just like other movies they had seen that year. I loved the chatter and the energy in the room. It just felt like something that you usually get from like a theater experience if you're seeing like a play or a different like performance,
right?
Where you do have that intermission and you are able to like feel the energy of the crowd. I just loved it in a movie theater, and
it creates like a micro monoculture.
Yeah,
and it feels like you're actually in a film community, in an artistic space. In this case, for like almost 4 hours.
Yeah.
So I completely agree.
So you would be fine with it in other movies too?
Give it to me in like 90-minute movies. I'll take the break at the 40-45-minute mark. I'm good to like stand around for 10 minutes, talk to neighbors. We were listening on people's conversations, and everybody was discussing this movie in like great length. Man, there was all ages at our screening. I would say there were more like 45 plus on average, and it was a pretty big showing.
Yeah, I was trying to gauge
it was
the
sold
room,
out. I would say there was probably like 150, 200 people in there, but there were some younger people. There were some under 30s, but mostly 45 plus, and people were discussing this movie narratively first and foremost. Obviously there's a lot cinematically to discuss, especially that amazing, beautiful, but also haunting opening sequence that I'm really excited to talk to you about. But people were talking about the story about this Hungarian Jewish architect, Holocaust survivor, seeking refuge in a post-war America, in pursuit of the American dream, only to be exploited by the very myth makers of that dream. And then you heard people talking about maybe the performances. Someone next to us was talking about how crazy, funny, and absurd Guy Pearce was
Yeah.
in this young Logan Roy or young Peter
Wayland.
Wayland.
Yeah,
for
it's
Prometheus
exactly what I
heads.
was thinking about. Yeah. I mean, that was definitely really fun.
Yeah.
I guess, people can let us know in the comments if you enjoyed the intermission, because I was thinking if we're, calling for an intermission in all movies, like if we're a lot of times sometimes we're the only ones in the theater if it's like a
Sure.
or there's a few people in the theater, so maybe it wouldn't be the same experience, but
if you're just in a theater with one other person, yeah, that's funny.
Or like, yeah, and also like, if there's like a horror movie, we have
Get your letterbox
intermissions,
out. Don't make it
and
weird.
it's
Just like
just us two.
swap.
Which we've definitely been in a lot of horror movies with just like one other person.
Yeah. We have some bad stories. Yeah. Some tough stories.
So maybe not. But in this particular,
I didn't think about it like that. Yeah.
This particular atmosphere, it was great. People let us know your experience. But for the actual movie, I didn't know how I would feel. I was trying not to like read anything, listen to anything that would, impact my experience with something that was being lauded as like a masterpiece, like not only the best movie of the year, but maybe like an instant classic.
Sure.
Like,
yeah.
And so but I think that obviously like did have some sort of, while not hearing any specifics about the movie, that kind of like the Brutalist is this 5-star.
You had an expectation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, and so going into it, obviously like that does impact me a little. The first half of it though, I will
Part
say,
one.
was great. I thought that I was really in, and I didn't know if I would meet that kind of, this is a 5-star movie, but I thought I was going to get there after the first half when we went into the intermission, which we didn't like share with each other during the intermission. We were trying not to talk, right?
Yeah. Except questions we had about the plot.
Yeah, maybe just besides
some
like
mysterious elements.
Didn't you love
of
the
the
Peter
narrative.
Wayland like piece of this, or so very like light stuff.
I showed my family. I gave them a $500 check.
Yeah.
That stuff was really funny to discuss.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And also, a very similar energy in the Prometheus alien world from Guy Pearce. But I think in the second half, it lost me a little.
Okay.
I still think that it's a cinematic achievement. I think it is an amazing film to look at. I think part of that also has to do with like incorporating kind of very smartly like the aspect of beautiful architecture.
Yeah, the actual
this
brutalist
grand
architecture.
movie. Yeah. So I was locked in for the full movie, but there were some narrative choices towards the end that I don't think really like, it's not me saying like, I wish this was done differently.
Sure.
I think it wasn't effective in the fuller, broader story that was being told.
Yeah.
While I also think though, like some of the more surreal elements of the second half actually did work. So I'm interested to see like what you think about it as a whole, but what did you think? Like I know it is one full movie.
Yeah.
But I did have a very like interesting experience of dropping a little bit in the second half. What about you?
Yeah, no, similar experience. I like this movie less than you do. I would say I like this movie a lot less than critics I really admire, that I read from all the time, that I listen to in different podcasts. I had a really conflicting experience with this film because I loved it on paper. I loved everything cinematically that you're saying. I loved it visually. I loved it sonically. I really liked it structurally. I think it is really ambitious to have people sit down for 4 hours and to go through this epic without ever feeling the pace, which I don't. The editing is wonderful on this movie. The performances are very good. I think the tension of this movie between this Jewish man who is attempting to acculturate while trying to get his family back from Austria is devastating, and the kind of cost of acculturation and assimilation in this movie is fascinating, and what that leads to, what that engenders, is a really interesting conversation that we can have today in the spoiler section, as we're still in non-spoilers right now. I think that a lot of the dramatic tension that I love from part one was lost a bit in part two, and then comes back in the epilogue in a place that I felt was underdeveloped. And what I mean is there's a big commentary in this movie outside of just the immigrant journey of this conversation or intersection of art and commerce, and how we make art in a capitalist world, in a post-industrial world, like in a late capitalist world even today, because there are contemporary lenses on this film. How do we do that? Like, how do we do that without sacrificing our own ethics and our own morals in different ways? And so even though this movie is featuring this massive immigrant journey, it also doesn't feel like an epic because we're not seeing a start to finish of something in particular, but we are seeing a sort of cost of myth making, a cost of who controls history, a cost of who controls your art over time, the redefining of art over time. So there's really big ideas that I feel are fascinating in this movie. However, what I will say, and what kept me back from loving it throughout both parts, is that it's a really self-important movie. It is really treating itself seriously, and it is about a story that should be treated seriously, but it's also within a genre of movies that I've just seen so many of.
Yeah.
And I really felt like there was a missing contemporary struggle or lens on this film outside of what art making is like in our capitalist society today, which was surprising considering the subject matter, considering what you could do about the cost of the immigrant experience in America and the exploitation of labor and the ruling class versus the working class. I was hoping for more exploration of identities in particular that are not on the forefront of these kinds of stories, because we have seen the Jewish experience in American epics before. We have seen the Italian experience in American epics before. So these are things that we have come to be normalized to in American cinema from the greats, right? From a Martin Scorsese, from a Paul Thomas Anderson. And so I guess what I'm saying is the movie fits neatly in the canon of a Godfather, of a There Will Be Blood, but I was almost frustrated by the repetitiveness of what I was seeing, because if you have seen these movies, there was a little bit of just like mimicking going on.
I mean, it's hard obviously with the
narratively and tonally
imagery, like not to see There Will Be Blood, right?
Yeah.
Like not to see, PTA like all over this movie.
And I don't mean theft, by the way.
No,
I just mean like I was hoping for something a little bit original considering the runtime.
Yeah.
And considering that this director had, the full editing power, the studio allowed him to do what he wanted with the movie.
We always tend to, like fall on the side of like people absorbing different choices like as influences, right? Like unless there's something that's, I don't know. A lot of times you hear critics say like, this is copying this movie and therefore like, I don't like it.
And they ding points off, which is not what we do.
Yeah, like art
movies
is just
are inspired.
Art,
there's homages.
So it's not that for me, but it does. I think the reason I had a similar reaction too was like I'm seeing a lot of like similar, influences, but you would expect like in a movie coming out in 2024 from a kind of a similar like thematic story that we've seen in movies.
Yeah.
The tropes, I guess, that are
tropes
outdated.
And archetypes. Yeah.
That you see then like reoccur in this movie.
Yeah.
And then also kind of like what you're saying, like maybe not challenging the audience as much as you could or telling a more complex story as you could with because we've already seen different parts of this story. And so I think that's ultimately where I came out on it too. And part of the going into the Brutalist as a masterpiece conversation, discussion, right?
Also,
the expectations that also obviously impacts a part of it has to. But I do think just like if I were to see it without that, I would still have like similar thoughts, right? Like
yes, yeah. And I guess to contextualize what we're talking about, when I said self-importance, and that's kind of what we're talking about with this movie, like is it self-congratulatory in a sense?
Yeah.
And I think it is, but what
it's not that the story obviously like isn't important.
Yes, the story is
it's acting like
the
it
movie
is almost like
it.
Already a canon movie or
something.
Because of the influences it's playing with.
Exactly. And I appreciate that about it. Like, I love angry, radical storytellers who are telling you what's important about the world, because I like artists with a vision who are unafraid of a studio's, like, maybe opinions on what that vision should be. I think that's what's fascinating about movie making in particular, because we're seeing dozens of artists and their opinions on screen. Like Adrien Brody's performance as this lead character, he might have a very different view of László's journey in this movie than the filmmaker and the writers did, right? So like that's a really interesting part of the movie making process, and this movie feels very self-aware of those things. So there's a lot of like subjectivity in the film, but there's enough dense layering of symbolism and visual metaphors, or literalizing some of those metaphors, but in such like interesting ways sometimes that it allows for so many different, I think, interpretations of the film, which I really appreciate. But I think that self-importance can also be good in other ways. Like this movie, in a lot of ways, is about an artist trying to not sacrifice too much in order to make their art, to stamp their legacy. Now, who co-opts that legacy in the future is an interesting conversation. But this movie is like using a historical or contemporary struggle to get a movie off the ground that is about movie making, like Brady Corbet is doing that. And I think that's fascinating. Like sometimes we, as people in the film critic space will go, okay, do we need another movie about what it's like to make movies? But if you can do it in this way, where it's through a story that is like authentic and about a marginalized experience, about something that is very poignant today too, unfortunately, that is very interesting. And I think he was able to accomplish that. Now, one of the reasons it's not going to be one of my favorite movies of the year is what I've been talking about, which is that it didn't stand out enough to me as an original piece of movie making to actually warrant its 4-hour existence. And I'm not saying that from a pacing point of view. I'm saying that from like, I watched
we'll sit
4 hours
for
of
a
scenes
5-hour
and sequences.
movie.
Absolutely. But I watched 4 hours of scenes and sequences where I was like, oh, okay, I'm being odd in moments. These filmmakers did their homework. This is like a 20th century, mid-century immigrant tragedy, but the movie also feels like it's not interested in being provocative. It's interested in making a statement. And so it's very loud. It's self-assured. It's gorgeous. It's undeniably gorgeous. But I feel like I was conflicted walking out because it's the kind of movies that I've seen sometimes that are far too controlled, far too formal, far too unmessy and sanitized. And I do feel like this movie could have been a little bit more radical in what it was trying to say, considering, especially if you take into the fact what we know about the filmmaker and him having access to doing what he wanted to do with the movie, which is amazing.
Like Final Cut,
right. And he still wants to make it commercial. But I was just really surprised, considering like our current climate, that this is as far as it went. And I guess we can get into spoilers in a second because I feel like we've hit all the non-spoiler stuff. But again, I'll recommend it to any listeners or anybody watching at home. Even though we're talking about this movie maybe lacking a new depth or original depth and layers throughout the entire runtime, and maybe it does retread like an archetypal story that we've seen before, it does it at such a high level that it's hard to deny it as a successful work. It is a successful work. It knows what it is, and it's certainly doing it at a high frequency and at a high level. But I'm just not sure. I just expected more considering the subject matter. That's like that's where I was leaving the movie. I was impressed by the cinema of it all and let down a little bit narratively in terms of where it went with it by the second part of the movie. Yeah,
I think observing our vibes after the first half, I think I still like it more than you.
Okay.
But we'll see in the spoilers here as we go into it as to like why we both, I guess, felt like it felt a little short in the second half. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely obviously well worth your time to go see it on the biggest screen possible. It is beautiful, and there are just some, I think, what we'll get into in a second, different like things that I was maybe like underwhelmed by.
Yes. No, yeah. Okay, so let's put a spoiler warning out now. I'm putting out a little bit early just because there's a lot of movie to talk about, a lot of movie to discuss. Okay, so like I said, on paper, this is a tragic immigrant tale, one that may seem familiar to you, but Corbet also is more interested in exploring that relationship between art and power that we were just discussing, specifically the patron-artist dynamic between this character named Harrison, who was played by Guy Pearce, who is this charismatic and repulsive patron of the arts, but also industrialist, war profiteer, and László, our main character, who is consumed by his desire to leave a legacy, but also to get back his family, and the conflicting goals of those things sometimes, and what the American spirit or ethos can do to someone as a sort of parasite, even somebody who's coming from such a tragic life, as somebody who escaped and is seeking refuge from the Holocaust, as László did. And the film leans on archetypes, so we're going to be talking about those and blunt symbolism. We'll try our best to unpack that as much as we can after just seeing it last night. And we also have other characters like László's wife, played by Felicity Jones, who is a classic like troubled intellectual wife trope, which we'll definitely discuss. But she's also like the moral compass character, a little bit like the Kitty Oppenheimer situation from Emily Blunt's character a year ago in Oppenheimer. And then we also have their niece, who is a symbol of trauma, and we'll talk about whether she could have gotten more to do. There's a subplot with a heroin addiction for our lead character that feels well executed because it's used for dramatic tension, but also feels overly familiar and also feels sometimes forced.
Yeah.
Especially his relationship with his friend, who is a single father, who we'll discuss as well. And so there's a lot of tropes that we're talking about that we'll get into this story in terms of why it feels hollow. And there's design stuff in this movie that we'll talk about too that we loved quite a bit. All right, so this film opens with a breathtaking sequence. We have a monologue from a yet to be named young Jewish woman who is the niece of László, our lead character, and it is László, I believe, right? I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that.
And it's actually his wife who's writing the letter.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, as she's writing the letter to our lead character, we're overhearing that letter reading, that monologue, while we're watching a group of refugees aboard a chaotic ship being greeted by this inverted image of the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah.
Which is a wild shot. And I'm sure those of you who have seen the movie or haven't seen the movie and you're still listening, you know what I'm talking about because it's been everywhere online on film Twitter. And we have this troubling monologue paired with this striking visual, which is then again paired with another tool of cinema, which is this great score from Daniel Blumberg. Or Blumberg, I apologize. This actually, I think, deserves the word monumental. The score is phenomenal. It's my extra credit of the movie. It's what I think deserves more recognition about The Brutalist. It is a subversive American anthem-inspired score because it also feels like a little bit fascistic. It is a very, I think, conflicting tone running through the score. It is a really interesting piece of music. And this sequence really sets the tone for the story and the exploration of the journey of this refugee and his journey of as a struggling artist attempting to create a legacy for himself and their identity. So it is right away, this is going to be a massive story of displacement, acculturation, survival, reinvention. Something you probably would realize on rewatch, but something I thought about last night is when we see him waking up from like this deep slumber that he may have just been given the drugs at that point in time, the heroin that he eventually becomes addicted to, because I think he gets woken up by somebody on board. So after the first 5 minutes, you're like, oh, this movie not only feels like an important movie, but it also knows it's important, which goes back to that self-importance.
To be fair though, like when we first saw that opening sequence, I was like, whoa. Yeah. Okay. This is what everyone's talking about.
I felt really emotional, genuinely watching it. Yeah.
And also I think I really enjoyed the like pieces every time we had a letter reading over images. I think it was really successful. I think this is the only piece that you shared with me during intermission, but you're like, that feels like that's been in his mind for a long time. Like just the opening that movie. Yeah. I mean, it was so well executed, like just an amazing opening to a movie cinematically. And I think also like the emotional aspects of it, all this like overlapping, right? Like history in a moment too was really well executed. And we see that like as we continue into the story, also towards the end when we see the wife writing a letter to the niece.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I felt like I was trying to think when's the last time I felt that kind of awe-inspiring feeling where cinema evoked like these multiple different feelings at once, just from specifically the score. And I rewatched the 25th anniversary of Phantom Menace, Star Wars Phantom Menace in theaters like a year ago. And which was a great experience. I'd never seen it in theaters. We were too young when it came out originally. You were sick, so I had to go see it by myself. And I did not realize, because it was a daytime showing, that a bunch of parents are going to be taking their little ones, their kids.
That's amazing.
So there was a little boy sitting next to me.
It's their first experience, yeah.
And we would get that Star Wars opening crawl. It's like, dun, 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 and the crawl's like about trade tariffs and all that. And this boy is like, you could feel, like he was talking, eating chicken fingers, and he like, I could tell like this was going to be an experience.
Yeah.
But as soon as that crawl hit and the music started playing, he couldn't move. I could like sense him being like, wow, I'm watching something important.
Yeah.
And I felt similar to that kid watching the beginning of The Brutalist in a much more tragic way.
Yeah.
Also, Duel of the Fates, I guess I'd just give this kid a shout out. I don't know who he was, but like he's going to have a great life, I think, because as soon as the Duel of the Fates pop up and Darth Maul is fighting Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn, he literally gets up from his seat and just stands there watching the Duel of the Fates. And I felt that. I felt seen.
You should have stood up with him.
Oh, man. Yeah. Anyways, it's a strange tangent for this movie, but I'm sure you guys appreciate that.
But yeah, no, I mean, I think that
it has that feeling.
Yeah,
when
the
watching
score is really.
It's almost like pressuring you to stand up. It's like it feels like
you mean like that kind of anthem?
Yeah, the anthem of it. It feels like it's subverting the Pledge of Allegiance or something like that. I felt like that.
I didn't think about it that way, but I do think,
Or
you
the
know,
national
thematically that does make sense in terms of like the subversion of the American dream.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. I mean, it does have like aspects of like an anthem type of musical piece. So yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I felt like this kind of like melancholy in moments. It was played in slower moments. I thought it was just like really well used.
I was going to ask you that. Do they reuse it throughout the movie?
Yeah,
and they slow it down
in the second part. Yeah, there was like it was just used in different. Again, we just saw it last night, but yeah, I think it was used in different ways. With it was slowed down in certain sequences, but I've always felt like emotional when it was in the background.
So we are introduced to László, who we see at a brothel with a sex worker, and then we see him kind of enter into the New York scape. I think the sexuality of this movie and like what of the characters in this movie is fascinating. That's probably like a deeper discussion on multiple rewatches, and the kind of psychosexual relationship between a few different characters. But we do see that as the opening scene of this movie, and then we see him as this like Hungarian Jewish architect, Holocaust survivor, basically just trying to find a job. He goes to meet his cousin. He arrives in post-war America.
Also a really emotional like moment of them embracing and him finding out that
from the bus,
his wife and his niece are still alive.
Yes.
We find out later on in a really also like sad moment that that's his sister's child, right? And that she was sick. And so like his connection to her that we don't know yet, but just the performance from Adrien Brody immediately was, I was really, again, I was just like continuously like, oh, okay, this is what people are talking about. Like this movie is really gonna go somewhere. But I think those moments I never totally got back to, but but still like a very impressive opening and an amazing performance from Brody.
Right. And I think especially because Brody comes into America with that dream that we know so well to be much more complicated when examined. But like you can feel him knowing that he's entering a place that accepts immigrants. And he knows that because he's been told that. And he's also like on the ship and he, you know, lands and then only realizing throughout the movie slowly but surely this is a place that might be excluding immigrants. And really they only accept immigrants when it's convenient to their labor, like the country's economy, and depending on what families control the economies of which regions will depend on like what immigration status looks like in that region. And so in this case you have somebody who is like looking for something better than cheap to free labor. He's going to work with his cousin who owns a shop, who's completely acculturated and like sacrificed his own identity, really.
Right. He changes his name right to like Miller and Sons.
And he's Catholic now, as he says.
Yeah. And I thought also that was like a not completely like in the second half where I felt like there were some narrative choices that felt like they were really like I felt the choice like written on the page that here I felt like the conversations between him and his cousin and László of like, you know, the Americans like family and they want a certain name, right?
Right.
And like the kind of like stakes like and political like landscape that is embedded in that conversation where you like kind of feel the tension as well of his cousin's experience like living in America, and we kind of know where László's, you know, story might go. I thought that was all like really well done in terms of dialogue in the first part.
What did you think about the relationship to László, his cousin, and then the cousin's wife, the partner? Because that I think was a confusing aspect of the movie for me. I couldn't tell how much, and I'm forgetting her name, I don't have it here, but the partner of the cousin, how much she was making xenophobic comments or how much that she was in a relationship with someone who was toxic, who was manipulating her, which is the cousin figure, who is Miller now, but the person who owns this furniture store that László is going to work at for the next like 25 minutes of the movie until he's inevitably kicked out after a deal with Guy Pearce's character goes wrong. And he's also told by his cousin that he made that Adrien Brody's character made an advance at his cousin's wife, which we know not to be necessarily true if you trust the POV of Adrien Brody's character, which I will. I'll take that part of this movie literally. So I was going to ask you, what did you think about the wife figure? Because she makes a comment about his nose.
Right.
Which I couldn't tell if it was a xenophobic comment, a comment out of prejudice, or if it was literally a comment of him hitting his nose,
right?
Because he took drugs. Because
I think it's supposed to be
both.
Like it's supposed to be like the prejudice embedded in. Like,
interesting. Okay, that's what you're talking about.
Like comment of like care. And so it was kind of this, right? How he later, and this has been like the big scene that is used to market the film, is like Adrien Brody in the car later with his wife of "They don't want us here," explaining to his wife like why would his cousin's wife say that, right? And so I viewed like this kind of her as a character of what we'll later see in the I'm forgetting Guy Pearce's
Harrison.
Okay, Harrison's character, right? And basically like everyone that László will come to like interact with mostly. So I just viewed it as like the kind of the first step of this.
There's always a second
facade,
meaning,
right?
Behind this American acceptance,
exactly,
of somebody who ultimately they have a strong prejudice against, if not racist against. So yeah, that's fascinating. The reason I'm asking is because the cousin inevitably tells them after a long party together and the deal breaking through with Guy Pearce's character that, yeah, you made an advance at my wife, so I'm not going to hurt you, but you have to leave. You're no longer working with me. And we do know from being in, Adrien Brody's character's POV that night when he was forced to dance with his cousin's wife, that when he was leaving, the wife said, you should find a job elsewhere.
Right.
You could be used elsewhere. You're really good at what you do, which could also be read as what you're talking about, that double meaning of, oh, is this a xenophobic person, a Catholic American who's trying to push this Jewish person outside of her family?
I don't want you staying in my house.
Right.
Like,
or does she actually or does she actually care about him and she does think her husband is a little bit volatile, which we do know from the way he was just acting.
Oh, meaning that she maybe didn't even say that to her husband. Her husband the cousin just said that?
The way I read it, which is why I asked you, because I did read a few reviews from like Ehrlich this morning and Adam Naiman, and I didn't see this anywhere, but the way I read that scene where the cousin comes into Adrien Brody's room and kicks him out was that he felt shame for because what he did that night and also the way that deal fell through.
Right.
And he put the blame on Adrien Brody's character as to not reflect on it himself and also to tell his wife that it was not his fault. Because there were moments where we were left with the wife's POV, that dance night that they had.
Yeah.
And she felt kind of uncomfortable by the whole situation. She was telling him to stop forcing Adrien Brody's character to dance with her, which again, the double meaning could be because she, is anti-Semitic, right? But it also could just be that the cousin had basically, because of this American disease that the movie is trying to explore in this film, he just was a volatile person that she felt uncomfortable around.
I mean, we definitely saw this piece of like, forcing Adrien Brody to dance with his wife in terms of like, this is like my property, look like that the life I've built sort of strange, I think again, it's obviously like a comment, not necessarily totally on the character, but of like the environment of like this capitalist, right? Like system that his cousin is now having to participate in, and like where he is assigning his worth. He also like at one point during the conversation asks László, like, is it smaller than you thought it was going to be? And László says, I had like no expectation. And so like this idea, right, of like measuring yourself against like money as, so I think that was definitely like a piece of it, but that's interesting.
That's a really good point, because there is a level of like László being kind of confused by self-interest. He seems like somebody much more interested in collective interest. Like he doesn't maybe even know that there was like a debate between those two things. And he comes to America and his cousin, who is like fully assimilated, has like turned into something that he doesn't know, like from name to the performance he's putting on as an American.
Well, I think that's why the conversation was so interesting. It was like you felt the reason for the distance of like, I don't recognize you anymore, sort of, right?
Yes.
And then we obviously have that moment of he goes to build the library at Guy Pearce's house, right? Because Guy Pearce comes home, and I think they were like basically done building the library.
They just had to put the books in.
Yeah, and
can we get one of those for our movies? That'd be sick.
All those shelves. But then, right, Guy Pearce, obviously it was like just throws this huge fit.
Tantrum,
we can tell he's like a very aggressive man. And he then
also racist, because we already met Adrien Brody's character's friend at this point,
right,
who we'll talk about in just a second. But he makes a comment that is racist, and so we're recognizing who this is at this point. This is like an industrialist. This is one of these tycoons who sold weapons to who? Question mark is like an interesting conversation. So
but I think it was like smart to introduce us to the Guy Pearce character this way, because then we also understand like immediately what's underneath this kind of meeting at the coffee shop later on. Also like his children, right? It's not a surprise when later on, like the Harry character, or just very soon after, the Harry character, his son, decides not to pay them, right?
Right.
Even though they've built the whole library,
Yeah.
like, and what he says later on to László's character. So I think that it was smart to introduce us to the Guy Pearce character in that way.
Yes, and we're about to get deeper into that. Let's talk about the friend real quick of László, where we meet Gordon, who is played by Isaac de Bencoli, I believe is how you pronounce his name. I apologize if it's not. He does a very good job in this movie. Doesn't get a lot to do as this black single father who's just trying to make ends meet, or make ends meet as László is. And László eventually hooks him on heroin as they go out.
I think that's what we're supposed to understand from the like jazz club. Yeah.
Yeah, as they go to jazz clubs, and they don't use heroin as like a judgmental device in this movie. It's really just a way for these like people to self-medicate during this like tumultuous period in American history, post World War II, or at least for groups who have been historically marginalized. And so the movie's doing a good job of not. This movie sometimes does condescend to the audience, and we'll get into that in part 2. But it doesn't do that here, where we just realize that these are, socially, emotionally, intellectually, like people who deserve more than what these elitists have, but ultimately are like stuck in this like oppressive, exploitative position of labor. But I will say this, next to the intellectual but troubled wife figure in this movie, I think the most cringe archetype or trope of this movie is the white protagonist having a black friend who's underdeveloped and not really a character. Even though we learn something about his son, even though we learn that the mother and the partner died when he was very young.
Yeah, we have like the dinner scene, but still.
Yeah, it feels forced.
The character is basically like a device to then tell us about Adrien Brody's character.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the worst part of it is politically, like, black characters are used all the time in white, quote unquote, white stories like this, because they're trying to get the audience to attach or project morals onto the white protagonist.
Yeah.
And so in this case, while it might seem totally normal for people to see a middle-aged Jewish man coming into a community that is not his own, but he's being accepted by it, and he's in a breadline, and he makes friends with a single black father and his son in front of him, and he says, "I'll save your spot in line the next day." You might think, well, that's a common thing to do, maybe in the Jewish community, a collective interest in your fellow person, in your community. That's perfectly a fine reading of that. But historically in movies,
in film, it's like
this is usually a trope that has been evolved from like a standard of practice to try to get audiences to connect to the lead character. Historically, usually it's not individuals like human beings. It's usually like Ripley saving a cat from the Nostromo and Alien.
Yeah.
The save the cat trope, which is like, oh, Ripley's a good person, we swear, because she like wants to save her cat. That's my favorite movie of all time. She is a good person. But in this film with The Brutalist, what was troubling about it is it plays in so many tropes like this that feel unexamined. And it does make you reflect on how much of this movie is just so archetypal that it just does not have any originality of its own. But what it's archetypal in, like the canon that it's playing in and what it wants to be anointed in, is such a high degree of filmmaking that you can't help but respect it or admire it. But you're just hoping for a little bit more, considering the fact it's 2024.
You're like, if you're going to, basically, I don't want to say completely reuse, but if you're going to like incorporate influences, like from these kind of epic stories that we've seen, you should, even though it was written 7 years ago, who cares? Like, you should definitely be updating a lot of these like problematic tropes, which I try not to say like the word problematic, but
it's like a trigger word for so many people. But in this case, like tropes, I mean, tropes are the reason they're tropes. They're always like these successful bits of movies to get a genre film made. In this case, we're watching a melodrama, really. And so like this is a big trope of it, which is the white protagonist has a black friend. Yeah. And it's great for like black actors like this, the man who plays our lead friend in this movie, who gets paid to be in this movie, but unfortunately, like he's playing an underdeveloped character. Yeah. Much like Felicity Jones's character as the wife in this movie, she gets a lot more to do than he does, but her character is really a tool or a device to really explore the brutal genius of, it's not that like it's not that Kitty Oppenheimer, but it's
than that, but it's still close. She's used in a very similar way. Like if
only she had the code to understand her husband's brain.
Yeah, although like I thought that was I did think it was a beautiful line at the end when she was like, the man I married is locked inside, and like I don't have the code to decipher.
And the movie does feel poetic in moments like that. Yeah,
and I was like, that like sounds great, but I felt, you know, that I think I like understood obviously, and like there were successful pieces of like going or following their marriage too, right? But in terms of like how she was used, it was like so again like a trope of a woman like essentially, especially during the sex scenes. I was like, this feels so from like
a male gaze. Yeah.
It felt so like you know, her character was specifically a device to like tell us that he's a genius. It's just like an eye roll. And then also then like, you know, there's this like duality that's often in these like very unexplored roles, or like I guess just like not complex, where it's like she is supposed to be kind of like again uplifting our main like male protagonist,
the great woman behind the great man.
Yeah, but then like with Guy Pearce's character, she gets to like intellectually spar with him, and it's just this like cringy use of like putting in like a woman. Literally what Guy Pearce says, which is like supposed to be ironic of like, oh, the woman behind the man, right? Because she is basically right, she's like they're saying like you're insulting me. She's like, I went to Oxford, and like basically like we see we'll go into that in the second half of like how the family is treated by the Guy Pearce character. But I was so I think like put off, I guess, by how her character is written. And I guess again like this is a part of why I can totally understand like the cinematic aspects of how this movie looks, and also like story elements of why it is an important story to tell. But these dated tropes just felt so much like, I obviously can't say this is a masterpiece level, and I'm just surprised that like people are saying that, because it feels like I don't know.
You know what's strange
to see now?
Can I bring up a movie that's very divisive? Well, first of all, to expand on your point, if anybody's like, all right, I don't know if the great woman behind the great man trope is that big of a deal. It is a very big deal right now. Like last year alone, we had Oppenheimer, Ferrari, The Iron Claw. There are several films that always...
Bradley Cooper.
Oh yeah, Maestro. Yeah. Like there are several films where they're attempting to be historically accurate but socially progressive, where they're like, actually, there's a pretty smart woman behind this guy who's a genius, and so like we should shout her out for a few scenes. We'll give her like a monologue at the end,
but just a few
to save the lead. And Kitty Oppenheimer gets to do the "I don't like your phrase," and then in this movie, Felicity Jones gets to make the metaphors of the movie very blunt, and so she does get like a tragic scene in her own right, and that's supposed to be empowering of László. We'll get to that at the end. What was I about to say? Oh, a movie I thought a lot about while watching The Brutalist. Well, first of all, I thought a lot about Martin Scorsese, obviously, as we're big Scorsese heads.
Yeah.
I thought a lot about Paul Thomas Anderson because we are PTA heads, and he's probably the best director of the 21st century.
And we thought about you too, yeah.
And
all the Paul Thomas Anderson heads.
We did. And then I thought about Damien Chazelle, because we had Sean Fennessy. We had Sean Fennessy from The Big Picture, The Ringer's Big Picture, and Amanda Dobbins podcast as well. Great show. They just talked about The Brutalist a month ago with Adam Naiman, who we've also had on the show. But we had Sean on recently for Ridley Scott, but 2 years ago for the Damien Chazelle episode.
Right.
And the reason we had him on is that I wanted to ask him, like, hey, do you think Damien Chazelle is our next PTA, next Martin Scorsese, next Spike Lee? Like, is this somebody that's going to be exploring the plight of the American dream, the plight of the American experience, or the lies of it? And I don't know if he was completely sold by that idea, but we did discuss it for quite a while. And I'm bringing that up because Chazelle's made some of the great like tragedy of being an American of the modern era, contemporary world movies, like from Whiplash to La La Land, First Man, which is arguably his best film that explores this very well in very complex ways, where there is a brilliant woman behind the man, except the way that Ryan Gosling portrays that man is very flawed and very like not genius man coded. But the movie I was going to bring up was Babylon, which is a movie about cycles of exploitation, which is a movie about an immigrant experience, which is a movie about marginalized communities that are not usually portrayed on the forefront of these kinds of stories. the Manny character in that movie. And that lead actor who played Manny, like not getting much love for that film. And Margot Robbie, of course, getting love, but not even enough. I don't know if she was nominated for an Oscar. I think it was just the score from Justin Hurwitz, which was phenomenal. But that movie was treated not very seriously because it didn't treat itself so seriously.
Yeah.
Because it was aware of what genre it was playing in. It was aware.
Well, it was like very explicitly talking about like the film industry, which The Brutalist also is. In terms of like the creative, right, like choices and the constraints.
Right.
But yeah, it's interesting to see like such a negative reaction to Babylon when it is like playing in similar, why people are so interested in The Brutalist as well in terms of like the film commentary or the creative commentary.
And I really think it's because like Diego Calva is like playing like a Mexican immigrant in that movie, and it just doesn't, to film going audiences who are still primarily being targeted for white audiences, or like the industry is still targeting the demographic of white audiences and overly representing them. I really think it's as easy as that, which is that people came to Babylon to see Brad Pitt and Margot Robbie and realized it was not their epic. And it was actually about them leaving the history of cinema and the reasons behind that, and actually like introducing people who have not been in the forefront of movies and art and commercialism throughout the history of this country. And that movie not being explored or examined that thoroughly with such like importance, the way The Brutalist is, has really made me like reflect on, even though we loved that movie when it came out, but now I even love it more. Like I want to rewatch it because The Brutalist seems like, I'm bringing this up because of the tropey figures in this movie. It seems kind of very much targeted at an older white audience who deserves to like,
audience too, or awards body,
and in a Jewish community who deserves a movie like this. And it's not just directed at a Jewish community. Obviously, it's for like any groups who have been marginalized in their immigration or their immigration journeys. But I don't know. I just thought about Babylon and was frustrated by the lack of support for a movie like that.
Babylon's an interesting like movie to bring up because it is exploring a lot of, again, like the constraints within the industry that Corbet has like talked about, you know, in terms of how he is writing Adrien Brody's character as an artist,
right,
and how he identifies like with the specific artistic themes of the movie. And putting things into movies.
But Chazelle noting how self-serious of a concept that is, so he finds absurdity. And he makes like fart jokes.
I know
in the movie.
There were some things.
So, like,
I mean, like for Babylon, takes the PTA route. I wasn't like, this is like 100% masterpiece, even though I love Damien Chazelle. There were certain pieces of the humor or like parts of it that I didn't love
that just don't totally land. But there's a fear of being too serious.
I will say with like The Brutalist, there were elements I think that in the first half reminded me of PTA in like a good way.
No good.
In terms of the like when Guy Pearce, you know, says we're going to build a library, a church, or I guess the church comes after the funding, but what else? Like a gymnasium, and a community center, whatever. But yeah, the swimming pool comment is what I'm thinking of, is where he starts to he calls Adrien Brody in at like the crack of dawn, and he's hungover, and he's like, just wait a second, like I need to get this idea out, you know, like dreams slip away, and then Adrien Brody gets his notebook out to kind of write down the ideas, obviously, that that Guy Pearce wants to incorporate in this giant community center. And he's like, we got to build a gym. And I loved wrestling, so like we have to have this. And Adrien Brody's like, well, let's make a swimming pool, maybe, right? Like a good suggestion. And Guy Pearce is like, I don't swim. Yeah.
Why would I do that?
Why would we need a swimming pool? I don't swim. So like those moments, I think were like deserved and like felt natural, like in terms of the humor and the absurdity of this Guy Pearce character. Similar to when we're having the conversation between the two of them over drinks, or like when he continuously, you know, keeps saying both at the coffee meeting and over drinks at his house for the dinner party of like, you know, I've said this before, but I find our conversations intellectually stimulating. Like, you know, just basically like showing us that he's like a clown, you know?
He's a pseudo-intellectual who made a lot of money from his dad or his family. Like he has generational wealth. Yeah.
And it's not just him, right? He's like representing, right, this like elite class who basically holds this status and gets to like make these choices.
Who also have like the jewels of exploitation. Like there's slow-mos in this movie that are brilliant slow-mos.
Yeah,
where you start seeing Adrien Brody's character start recognizing the amounts of wealth and then maybe connecting it to what we assume off screen is that he maybe saw in this post-Holocaust world. And so like that connection of like exploitation is really important. It's not connecting America to the Third Reich, but it's connecting a sort of ethos that would lead to something like that, like a genocide. And I think that is really smart filmmaking. That is like visual metaphors at its finest in this movie that PTA also does really well in most of his films. And I think if There Would Be Blood, The Master.
Yeah.
But then Phantom Thread is the movie I wanted to bring up because that movie finds humor in a depravity. That movie finds humor in like really tragic elements of the lead character Alma's journey in that movie. As somebody who, if you watch that movie close enough, it's one of our favorite movies of all time.
Yeah, we did it for New Year's for our Patreon last year. Yeah,
one of my favorite episodes we've ever covered.
I'm all sad we did it because like now I don't know.
Well, yeah, it's not forever over. We could do it again in a couple of years whenever they release that next PTA film. But her character is someone who is fleeing from the Holocaust as well.
Yeah.
And the resources of what Daniel Day-Lewis was doing to build the dresses is a very similar concept to what we're watching happen, except the roles are switched here, I think, as the artist. Well, sort of. The roles are different in The Brutalist. And so I'm bringing that up because Phantom Thread finds humor in the elitism, which is what The Brutalist does, but that's the easiest thing to find humor in. The hardest thing to find humor in is the actual like scathing commentary that's being made.
Yeah.
And I think that the Phantom Thread PTA is unafraid to do that, whereas I do think, and I'm sorry to be comparing directors and movies here because they're different, obviously.
Definitely, yeah.
But you can tell how much the DNA and formula of those movies is. The Brutalist would not exist without Phantom Thread, is what I'm trying to say, or There Will Be Blood, or The Godfather.
Yeah.
And so, like, it's important to like, if a movie is trying to hold itself to those kind of standards, to examine it with a similar lens,
or if it's being lauded as that,
or if being lauded by others, like critics.
Movie. Yeah.
So it kind of demands this kind of critical conversation.
Yeah.
And I do think he misses a little bit more of that scathing humor that would need a more interesting and dense commentary that some have alluded to, and I'll give credit to some of those readings at the end of this conversation and the epilogue in particular. But yeah, I just wish there was more of that dark humor.
Yeah, it's not necessarily that I don't think I need levity. That's not why I want the humor.
Yeah,
right.
That's how it's used, though.
Yeah, but I do appreciate the moments of seeing like of showing us which we can already observe, but like the Guy Pearce character, like his clumsiness and like him basically again like having this myth of meritocracy, like explaining why he deserves his wealth kind of idea, and again like that being him telling him his like life story of like making his business, which he says like the press was saying, this was my like first business, I was doing so well, I was actually like going under, like and then we have the insert shots of like jewelry and dollars being put down for like a card game, right? So those insert shots were also really well done, and that's why I like the first half of the movie so much, is I felt like it actually had moments of like highlighting the absurdity in its own way of this wealthy figure.
That's a good call.
And the contradictions through a humor, again, that wasn't serving as levity, but was actually like serving as a part of the thematic characterization of the Guy Pearce character. And then when we get into the second half, it's not that I need humor. I don't need humor in a movie like this. But I do think that it was like missing maybe like almost like not self-awareness. That's not the best way to put it, but almost like an awareness of like the kind of self-seriousness that you're talking about that made it not as impactful in the second piece of it. Again, not because it's not a serious like story. It's just that it was hitting too hard on a lot of the like plot points that felt then undeserved, weirdly, because it's like a 4-hour movie with intermission. But that's just like how I kind of felt at the end. And I don't need, again, like you, like I drink your milkshake. Like I don't need like that kind of humor like that.
I think it would be fun though.
Yeah. But I think the kind of,
but there's a repetitiveness.
Yeah. But
in what it's exploring, which I think is deserving considering the subject matter. To a certain extent, because we've also seen this so many times in movies. So like if people were coming out of this film, going back to expectations and going like 3.5, 4-star film, pretty good. Hopefully it gets nominated for Best Picture. That'd be great for like independent cinema.
Yeah.
I'd love that conversation if that's what was happening. That's how I feel currently.
Yeah. And I think like
if it was that it's a 5-star movie that should win Best Picture that's being talked about as the XYZ movie, that's kind of what, unfortunately, what our role is like movie podcasters is like have a conversation in a vacuum about the film and also have a conversation about the conversation around a film. And this one is in particular like kind of very challenging because people that are notable critics are like talking about this in a dense way that I just didn't have the same experience with it.
Yeah.
And that's totally fair of like audiences you did too, like just like normal movie going audiences. If you thought you had like this like layered out of body experience with this movie. I get it. I think what you're speaking to in part two is that the repetitiveness of the themes or explorations of what it's trying to do, and then the peppering in of like spicier subjects that are a little bit more complicated to make it seem smarter or more provocative than it is, really irritated me in the second part, where I was like, you can't just like bring up the state of Israel and like not explore that a little bit more.
Yeah.
Which some have argued that this movie does, and we'll talk about like the ethno-state, consequences of what happens in this movie in the epilogue, just shortly, because I'm still thinking about the film. Yeah. And so there's a lot going on in the movie, but also not a lot in some ways that people have like projected onto the movie. And so I hope we're giving context to what we're talking about, the humor at least.
Yeah, and I think I, also appreciate that the second half is like tonally supposed to be a shift from the first half, right? Like we see the gates when they're opening, and in the first like moment we see the home, and it's like kind of this lavish like, home that we
Bruce Wayne's manor.
Exactly. Yeah. Like it's in there's a lot of like land around it, right? It's almost like what we have been taught through like the just like American culture to be like, I want this wealth kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm seeing Architectural Digest like celebrity homes on like and so but and then in the second half, right, when we go back to the gates and it's like we're closing out when the Felicity Jones character right is going into the mansion, and we see like the gates in the dark. You're like, that place is like rotten.
It's like haunted,
right? It's like you feel like the rotten roots, like, and so that was effective. And
the full journey of the American acculturation experience is effective. Yeah,
the nightmare, right? The nightmarish like second half of the movie, completely changing tones from the first half. Again, to highlight what we've been talking about, this like American nightmare of commenting on the American dream was effective, but it just didn't work for me. I think. I was responding emotionally to like the historical aspects of the story, but to the story itself, again, like knowing the influences that the filmmaker is like incorporating, was again like underwhelming in a lot of ways because it felt weirdly stitched together.
Yeah, because there's multiple commentaries going on. Like when his wife arrives on the train in the second half of the movie to start the second part. I'm tearing up, like, because you don't think she's coming at one point. He's like, no, that's not her. And then you see her in a wheelchair, and he's like, what happened to you? I'm taken. I knew in that moment, I was like, oh, I like this story. I like what's going on in this self-contained melodrama. And then we have the kind of like the art versus commodity and the kind of commodification of your interest or creativity of American culture that László has to deal with or reconcile with a man who arguably like profited off of his own culture's like, or his own identity's like genocide. And so like you're reckoning with that, watching this almost like elevated scenario of the cost of being a capitalist in America that is really successful and effective. And those two parts of the movie are the most interesting. I think when the movie starts leaning too much into meta commentary of like, this is what it's like to make something, this is what it's like to make a movie or a monument to something, I find it to be really pretentious and like overstaying its welcome. And I think
using this like story as a vehicle for that is strange to me.
Well, because then it just feels contradictory, because it's about the cost of wanting to make something as a monument, the cost of making spectacle while criticizing spectacle is like a really confusing idea. And we talked about this with Jordan Peele's Nope a few summers ago, where that movie was so amazing as an allegory and so dense about a history of exploitation in North America, but like what was and about Hollywood is like this kind of manifestation of that exploitation and the fallacy of the American dream. But with the irony of that movie that Jordan Peele was reckoning with, it was that he was creating a spectacle in IMAX, exploiting spectacle, talking about the exploitation of others based on people making money off of spectacle. And so like that movie knew it was in this kind of catch-22, almost parody situation where it was doing what it was criticizing, which I still thought was brilliant, because if you're gonna do it, be aware of it. And the Brutalist sometimes didn't feel aware that it was doing that, if that makes sense.
And I think that like it's not that we can't explore like László's artistic ambition, right? Like as an individual, and like what he's not willing to compromise, and like as a full complex like figure, right? He doesn't need to be this like tragic archetype, but to incorporate like the constraints within Hollywood in a contemporary sense, like into the story, felt strange because other aspects weren't as explored in a story that we have seen before. Yeah.
The biggest one being László's political ideologies or the way he viewed his art. There was a moment when he's talking to Guy Pearce at the end of part 1. We're going to go to part 2 soon because we've, I think, stuck on a few different issues for too long. And sorry if we're rambling. I think we're doing things that are coherent here.
Yeah.
But
I feel like we're figuring it out.
Yeah, this has been a really interesting conversation. It's like revealing, I think, of like the different interpretations people are going to have on this film. But László tells him, like, I look at my art as like a political vehicle, essentially. At least that's how I interpreted what he was trying to say, without revealing that, like, I'm also looking at my art kind of being this radical contrast to whatever you got going on. Like, that's kind of what he was saying without Guy Pearce's character being totally aware, because he was so delusional and talking about like his mommy daddy problems and, you know, him not giving money to people who need it, and him trying to do this commentary or let's say like justify a conservative ethos or traditionalist ethos of like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just make it work. I'm not going to give you a handout, which he then, you know, the director and writers then literalize at the end of the movie when he like says that to László before he assaults him. And so like this movie is doing so many things at a high level, and then as soon as it tries to treat itself as a political commentary, as soon as it brings in Israel, as soon as it brings in like an ethno state, as soon as it brings in like the consequences of American imperialism and exploitation have led to others, like violence begetting violence, others wanting to commit violence against others.
Yeah.
That's where it gets complicated, because we don't really know a lot of László's internal life. We don't know a lot about what he thinks politically about the world. And I know that's a part of the character arc, because he is a Jewish man in a time where that his identity is not accepted and he's being forced to like shift his identity around. But the movie, its epilogue in the second part of the film demands you care about the political commentary or political ethos of this figure, at least from my perspective.
In terms of the focus on the art. As
the
like
focus on what the art means.
Throughline,
And ultimately, I think László treated the movie, if you will, for the meta commentary that he's making of this era, as a part of his personal legacy, the only thing that he can actually have a say on in this culture that says that you need to like stamp something, you need to own something, and you need to turn that into your own kind of brand or identity. And he felt like he was like really being poisoned by this American culture or ethos. And by the end of the movie, when he finally gets the monument made and we have the epilogue, then the movie transforms into something else that I think the whole film didn't actually contextualize or demand. Then it makes you re-examine like what the movie was actually trying to assert or explore, that I think is actually not well explored. And we're going to get into that in the epilogue. I don't want to be too ambiguous because we're already in spoiler section, but it would take a whole like conversation about it so we can move on in the plot. But I'm only saying that to say that the reason why we're maybe sound conflicted is because there are like 2 or 3, 4 different stories going on in this movie, and I like 75% of them. And the other parts that don't work, I think really don't work for me.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. And I think like there were, you know, moments of layering the story and also like archival footage, right? And I feel like if you're going to incorporate archival footage, like it didn't fully, I think, explore what it was featuring in the kind of like radio broadcasts or the kind of like advertisements or the, you know, the specific like images that it was showing. Like it wasn't really, I think, I felt unexamined by the end for me.
Yeah, it felt like supplemental stuff.
It felt like it was like almost, and maybe this isn't fair because I'll see it again, but it felt like it was almost like, I'm not going to totally have the conversation in the narrative. I'm just going to put maybe some different like contextual aspects in the background with this archival footage and then let the audience come there on their own. And I don't think that in a epic this big that's actually like necessarily, it's not like that's interesting subtextually and like for the audience or trusting the audience, right? I actually think that it's doing something uninteresting. Again, because we've seen this story before in like movies or like especially like telling the story at this particular time. So I felt like it was not where people could be like, oh, it's just trusting the audience. I felt actually like underwhelmed again.
Well, also considering the convenient choice of when to be transparent, when not to be, because this movie literalizes a lot of its visual metaphors.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
with thematic aspirations.
It picks and chooses like when to be
really the easiest things to be on the nose about versus not. And so like that. And again, I think sometimes when we have these conversations, and I'll move on to the plot, but Like,
this is the first time we've like talked to each other about it too, so we're kind of like making sense.
Yeah. But like we just watched Ocean's 11 recently. We're going to be covering that on the Patreon soon because Soderbergh has a few movies coming out soon because he's a king. He's making 2 movies a year. But Ocean's 11 in caper movies, like in heist films, is a 5-star masterpiece.
Mm-hmm.
If Ocean's 11 was like I'm a great American tragedy, well then you're in that subgenre now. So I'm going to be comparing you to the movies within that subgenre, like within that vacuum in that space. And so that's why we keep coming back to this movie on like so many different levels, because normally if a normal movie was like this ambitious and this good in let's just say a $1 to $2 million drama of like a family drama, a Noah Baumbach movie or something like that, I'd be like, it is one of the masterpieces of the year, and like Dee earlier this year, like considering that movie's budget, its scope, like I thought that was one of the best films of the year that nobody discussed. Right. This movie's like, I am big. I mean business. This is a serious film.
Or like Queer, like we just talked about, or probably mentioned earlier in the podcast also.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to be repetitive. So we meet Harry, who's the son of Harrison. Just realized the name similarity there. Played by Joe Alwyn. Mm-hmm. Best performance we've ever seen from Joe Alwyn. The Favorite, he's really good.
He was good in.
He's good in some Claire Denis stuff. He's good in Yorgos stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I feel like him and Nicholas Hoult are both doing this kind of like entitled, right, cast.
Man-child.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Playing this like bratty figure almost. Mm-hmm. And I feel like Joe Alwyn, I guess I didn't like, I haven't seen him in a lot, and so like I was impressed by his performance here.
Yeah, he's like a 3rd or 4th supporting role in most of the good work he's in. I haven't really seen him as a huge lead in anything, so listeners, let us know where this ranks up for you. But I thought it was the best performance I've ever seen from him.
Yeah, I've only seen him used in like comedy and like The Favorite, so that's why.
I wasn't sold on the accent at first, at the beginning of the movie, and then by the end, when he's like infantilized by what he just heard about his father, and you see him kind of like retract back to this younger self, which, there's a lot suggested there about his life and his relationship to his dad. He killed that moment.
I thought so too.
When he's running around the house and he's screaming out for his father, I was like, whoa, I didn't know he had this kind of depth as an emotional actor.
Yeah.
We see Harrison dismisses László and his cousin. They make that racist comment. Eventually László has to go back and find work with his friend. And then he's called back by Harrison to look at some pictures he made across Europe, buildings he crafted across Europe with the brutalist design or style.
Also like an emotional moment too of Adrien Brody's character, just like having the realization that there are pictures, right, of like what he's built.
Right.
Like he has to keep it. I like that when he gets the check, it's like almost like the pictures are far more meaningful to him, like in this folder.
Yes. And it's a lot's revealed here about this character, which is unsurprising, but this elitist, Harrison figure only cares about this man's skill set. He does not care that he is a refugee seeking asylum in America, and that's not why he's giving him a job or access to labor. You can see the dollar
signs in his eyes.
Yeah, he's like, "Oh, you're a European architect with an eye that is not here,
you're cheap
present,
labor,
and you're cheap labor." Yeah. Yes. So he's going to manipulate him to serve his own ambitions, and you're hoping László can do the same, which obviously he does to a certain extent. And László gets injected into this world of a young Logan Roy, and we have this kind of first part of the movie standout moment, which is the party that we kept bringing up between these two individuals, talking about their dreams, and Harrison revealing a lot of his greed and exploitation. And then eventually we get to, I think, the second part of the movie after this. I don't want to mess up this structure here, but yeah, we have part 2. I think it's called The Hardcore of Beauty. Which I should say part 1 was called
The Enigma of Arrival.
The Enigma of Arrival. Yeah. I think these are allusions to popular novels or poems. But the second act shifts focus to the László family, as his wife, played by Felicity Jones, arrives, and his niece, played by Raf Cassidy. I believe that's how you say her name. I apologize if you don't. She's very good in this, and as far as what she's asked to do, which is play somebody who is silent or mute because of like what had happened to her in the Holocaust. You're not sure if it's because maybe she doesn't speak English, even though it's been told to us that she does, and you don't know if her family's trying to protect her. But both of these women like have deep scars from the war. We see that Felicity Jones's character is wheelchair bound from a bone disease, and we've talked about her as like this tropey figure, but I think the performance is is good again as far as what she's able to do with that role. She's not given a lot. And then we have the kind of the niece figure. She doesn't get much to do, but there is a moment I want to ask you about with Harry, where I think there's a suggestion of assault that's off screen. Is that how you read that?
Yes, definitely.
I feel like it was confirmed at the end of the movie.
I think so. Yeah, that's
considering what the dad does.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely thought so. I think we turned to each other to like almost confirm, like, you know, did that just happen? I think it did, and then. But yes, at the end of the movie, it's like we almost are sure, right? Yeah.
So assault becomes just like a major motif of the movie, essentially, because like you're watching like kind of an implicit assault based on like labor exploitation, which is an interesting way to frame it, to like parallel sexual assault with like labor exploitation, like these people. Their bodies being used for free to cheap labor. And so like that part of it is interesting. I think some of the stuff about that commentary feels a little bit forced.
That's also where I kind of like had I
under-examined.
Yeah, exactly. Like it felt like a narrative piece or choice that was not fully explored and just kind of used to
create dramatic tension.
Exactly, dramatic tension, or like further a theme, but not actually explored for kind of the seriousness of it on its own. It felt like a metaphor, which was like, I think, a strange way to incorporate violence in a movie.
Well, I would have the metaphor makes sense to me. I think literalizing the metaphor into that actual act is questionable, and I think because it's underdeveloped as the dynamics between the characters to do that.
It's the underdeveloped piece of it is
why it feels like a problem. Yeah. And so, I mean, this is going to be one of those big subjective things. If people felt like they were, I think provoked.
Or the metaphor
Let's say provoked by these things and it worked for you, then I get it. Because it is a very long movie that is immersive. So if you're falling into these characters' journeys and it's tragic, then I understand why. It distanced me a little bit, but I understood why. He really wants to get across this exploitation inherent to America's economic culture. So we see the two women in László's lives start to adapt to their new lives. László is starting to become increasingly consumed by his obsession with completing the community center. And there are really some funny beats of this movie along this line of the beginning of part two, particularly in the moments about the actual, architecture debate, like what should be made in the monument versus what shouldn't.
It's just kind of like a funny conception at the start of having like a church, a gymnasium, a library, like that kind of concept, like adds to like an almost like PTA like piece of it. Like you feel like
but
a
the
master
architect
element.
they bring in
feel like
who's debating, and like László thinks he's like a hack.
The guy he's like, what have you made before? He's like a shopping center. Yeah.
Like that's good stuff. And like the meta movie commentary works with that thing too, because like I'm sure Brady Corbet has worked on movies where they've brought in another director to look at something, or another writer to look at something who's maybe only made Thor 2, and you're like, does this person really deserve to be looking at my screenplay that I worked on for like 8 years? I could see that kind of commentary between artists who are forced to like be at the will of patrons. Like I understand like that as a commentary is really interesting. But inevitably
and that worked as far as like the artistic theme that they're exploring with like filmmaking as like a,
Yes.
Yeah.
So the project starts facing like very massive obstacles, derailed supply trains, financial setbacks, clashes with Harrison's other developers, like we were talking about. Now, the dynamic between László and Harrison gets much more complex in the second half of part two of this film. There's a key sequence that takes place in Italy, I believe, at a marble mine. Probably my second favorite sequence of the movie because it's experimental.
Yeah.
Which I enjoyed.
I really love the surreal elements of like having the speech over the visual and not having it syncing up. I guess like, with the actual man telling us his story. And also I think it was also what I wanted more of the movie in terms of like learning about different people in László's life. The idea of like, right, like dropping the rocks, right?
To bring up another movie, Killers of the Flower Moon.
Okay.
That platformed the Osage community at a dire time where you have like these American industrialists oppressing, exploiting, and taking advantage of a community, committing like a local cultural genocide. that movie platforms Lily Gladstone's character in such a way where she is like the main character of the movie, but it also spends a lot of time with Leonardo DiCaprio's buddies and like Robert De Niro. And you are wondering at the end of that movie, like, am I watching a masterpiece or am I watching something that almost actually platformed a marginalized community in an actually accurate way with actual screen time? And you do have to wonder that when watching. I think Killers of the Flower Moon is a better movie than The Brutalist because it does do that a little bit better. But you have to wonder when you're watching this movie. I feel the same way as you. When I meet his single father friend, like Laszlo's friend, I'm like, I want to know about this guy. When I meet the Italian guy who fought with his counterinsurgency against Mussolini's people and dropped marbles on them, where's that movie? Like, there's a part of this of these stories that are attempting to be more progressive, but still focusing on like white protagonists and antagonists that they can't get away from for whatever reason, probably because of the market system of movie making in America. That you can't help but be a little bit underwhelmed because the movie does feel like ultimately it is exploiting like tragedies of people in the periphery that you never really see to create drama and tension. And I felt that in this moment where I was like, he was talking to his Italian friend. You could feel like I think he was Italian. I apologize if he wasn't, but that you could feel the history between the two of them, and you wanted to know more.
Yeah,
and you don't ever get anything else. And so I don't know if that's a credit to the movie for some people because there's a lot of moments like that where you're like, oh, this is dense, or if it's a criticism like how I feel more so.
And it wouldn't be a criticism if we, I think, explored more like in the actual narrative timeline of the story.
I think so too.
Yeah.
I shouldn't have to be like, I want an extra hour of this 4-hour movie. You know what I mean? Okay. So we get in that night, we find out that Harrison is in love with the marble. He wants them to bring it over. And this whole sequence is the only part of the movie that's shot in a surreal way, as you said. It's very hypnotic, where like the words coming out of this man's mouth are not, in line with his actual physical body, which is a really great shot. We just watched Moonlight the other night. They did a very similar thing.
Was I, did I see this right? That the subtitles were in red during this sequence?
Maybe I didn't notice that.
In the other letters, they were in yellow.
Oh, interesting.
Maybe I'm like totally misremembering.
That's cool.
Yeah, I thought maybe that.
Some color changes. And then later that night, something integral happens to this plot, a big reveal. The movie literalizes a power abuse that Harrison had over László psychologically and financially, and then it becomes physical. And we had moments in part 2 where things like this almost happened, where Harrison throws a coin at László at one point when his family comes, and he tells László to pick him up to assert the power dynamic to make sure his family sees that he is ultimately like this object to him, this commodity. And I don't think the filmmakers of The Brutalist or the writers, who I think are partners, the director's partner, and she's a filmmaker of her own in her own right. I haven't seen her movies yet, though I will. But this is a moment where I don't think they totally trust the audience because we get this really abrupt, sexually violent scene of Harrison assaulting László, where the movie shatters any kind of illusion of mutual respect that they may have had for one another, but also shatters the audience's interpretation of like what was going on between them psychologically.
Yeah.
And I think that was an important aspect of the movie that really held me in as like, oh, this could be something that is a classic. Like it felt like The Master where you're watching Joaquin Phoenix.
Yeah. And I think that is like the kind of literalizing and almost like not fully, I guess, to me, I guess at least, considering again like how violence is incorporated to literalize the exploitation and the like power dynamics of their relationship. I just think that it almost felt like, oh, like let's incorporate this because it will really like allow the audience to understand the true symbolic and physical violence. But yeah, like I felt similarly, and
I felt like it diluted the message because of what you're saying. It felt like almost for shock value to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I felt
unbecoming of a movie like this.
Yeah, especially with like sexual violence to be almost used in that way. That's what I felt like. It was just again like something that we keep coming back to of like to see this in 2024, or it's something that I am not going to just be like, oh yeah, this is. I know some people will see it as like this metaphor, or like something
like an illusionary,
or like an aspect that just adds to the thematic, right, like piece of the American dream and of the Harrison character.
Yeah.
But I just think again, like, yeah, I think I was off put because it felt like it was used as a device, as like something that was inserted into the story.
Yeah.
That I actually felt like because it was unexplored, similar to the scene where it's alluded to with the niece. Like,
yes.
I just felt like it was weirdly not rushed, but like in this massive, again, movie, because it's just like a piece of it, and it felt like it was there to further a theme, further a plot, but wasn't actually like totally. I don't know. Does that make sense?
No,
like,
there's two. Well, I think what you're saying is right on. I think the reason why it's hard to discuss is because this movie is so dense, but like it's not wrong for doing what it did. It's just that it's using something that is very serious, such as people self-medicating with drugs and alcohol in marginalized communities that have been pressured to by the state, where people only have access in like lower class or impoverished areas to barely any jobs or any access to employment. But like you see liquor stores everywhere, like there's drugs being pumped into like urban areas. And so like that kind of commentary being squeezed into this movie through the heroine felt very unexplored. And I also feel like the same way when it comes to like connecting labor exploitation with sexual assault. It felt like these are big ideas that a writer had who was very good at writing almost like a novel that tried to squeeze into a movie that didn't have enough evidence like through its sequences to actually deserve or demand those kind of very complicated parts of American culture. But it did it to, again, create drama or tension where there wasn't enough of it to demand a 4-hour sitting of a movie like this.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of those sequences, like the bar sequence at the jazz club where it's all hazy and our characters are on drugs, or the sexual assault scene at the end of this movie between Guy Pearce and Adrien Brody's characters, they're very similar to me in terms of like inserts to create like a tension moment or a shock moment of like what's actually happening to our lead characters, because the filmmakers and writers are needing something to something propulsive to keep the story going.
Undeserved,
and it's an undeserved tool.
Yeah,
you're 100% right. To us, to me, you're 100% right. Also, commenters, chill out in the comments if you don't like some things that we've been saying. Just it would be nice to get like critical conversations about the movies, that we discussed.
You saw it
in the comments. Anything negative or like mean energy, deleted. So we start seeing the end of this movie emerging. You can feel it. It's about to conclude. Something's about to pop off. You don't know what it is. We see Felicity Jones's character emerge as like the quietly powerful figure in the narrative, which was a surprise for me, and I was interested to see where they were going to take that. And she has a confrontation with Harrison in a really harrowing scene where, in a sort of public act of defiance against the people who were at his table, who I'm not sure who they were. I think there was an engagement going on, an engagement party.
Yeah, we can assume though that they were like important business
it seemed like they were
or something.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And so she accuses Harrison of assault in front of his family and associates, the daughter of Harrison, who we haven't really discussed because she doesn't really have a serious character in this movie because of like how masculine heavy it is again. But she is like kind of really thrown off the most by this.
Yeah.
And Joe Alwyn almost saw this coming. Like his character saw it coming. And like I already said, it felt like the end of Oppenheimer a little bit, like a wife sticking up for her genius husband who can't express himself because of the era, because of the time, because of the politics.
Yeah.
And so she did it for him because she loves him. And
yeah,
she's
it was
a strong
definitely
person.
written to be like an almost empowering like feature of this character. But again, like it felt so much like she is the like wife character.
Yeah.
Taking a stand. Like it felt very much within that, to me at least. And so it almost, again, because of how I felt like what we just talked about like was not deserved, then that was a strange way to end the movie too. That felt like undeserved for her character.
Yeah.
That's especially why the second half of this movie kind of like fell flatter for me.
Yes, I totally get that. Epilogue. And then we'll end out today's episode, which is one of our longest episodes in a minute on YouTube, I think. But this movie kind of demands it because it's 4 hours long. We are shot into the 80s, and you get an 80s version, like a techno version of the score, which I enjoyed as we're kind of roaming through Italy at one point, or Rome. Or
Venice.
Thank you. Venice. And we get a retrospective of László's work, which is held in Venice. And it features the community center, finally completed after years of us not seeing it completed, and a now adult. The niece is now an adult. The wife figure has passed on, I think, and László is aged. And the niece figure as an adult has also a child who is played by the same actress who played the niece throughout the film.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit confusing at first for me
just for
personally.
A second, yeah,
just for a second. And then they say the names and the camera pans and you kind of figure it out.
Yeah.
There's a really important quote as they're talking about how these cathedrals that László was building in the name of like Judeo-Christian culture, which is a part of like something we didn't discuss, of the Pennsylvania committee arguing to Guy Pearce's character that, you know, in order for us to be okay with you building this, it needs to have a church in it.
Yeah.
And this went against László's principles, also as like just a Jewish man, but also someone who just wanted to build the architecture as like a political statement or a place of refuge. Didn't want it to include any individual religion because of how that can obviously exclude others. And so we get a powerful quote though from the niece character at the end here. She says, "No matter what the others try and sell you, it is the destination, not the journey." And I've read some different readings of what the end of this movie means. We do know that the niece with her partner in part 2 moved to Israel. They hate America. They hate what it's doing to László and his partner as well. And they're saying that we need to leave. We have this ethno-state that will accept us. This movie is not ready to interrogate or have a conversation about the history of Israel and whether or not it should exist. It is not ready for that. However, it is also being lauded as a movie that is about that in a very troubling time for Palestinians. And so like you can definitely see how an Oscars or an Academy could convince themselves that this movie is about that subject. And this movie peppers in the word Israel or the state of Israel enough times to make it seem like it's about that subject. When in reality, it's less about that. And it's more so, to me, about how László's art was being co-opted in front of him as he is now this mute figure, you know, in his old age. And he's watching somebody who is interpreting their art how they see fit. And they're using it maybe to justify something that he might be terrified of, which could be an ethno-state that could lead to genocide in the future. And like that, I think, is more of the commentary that Corbet is trying to get at, which I do think is really noble and admirable if that is the interpretation that many people have. But it feels like the overall interpretation is actually that this movie is about these people's experience of the destination of actually coming back to your homeland, which I think is way more complicated. And I don't think, again, the movie is ready to even have that level of conversation. It's more so about history, art, commercialism, the crossover of these things, who tells stories, who takes someone's art, who reinterprets it, and why and how, and for what reasons or purposes, that I think makes this movie good at the end. Though it did leave me kind of feeling like, because it's so ambiguous, and it's not as successful in its commentary as something like last year with The Zone of Interest about exploitation and the effects of capitalism, then I am left to kind of be like, it feels like it took a safe route to not explore some of these ideas, and it took the more Oscar bait route of just planting some of these things that are very topical. Even though the script was written like 7 years ago, that conflict still existed 7 years ago. And so I think that was a little bit of a sellout to me as an audience member sitting in a 4-hour movie that is trying to treat itself as this massive epic that is like a thematically dense story. And I know people are going to feel very differently about that. That was my interpretation of the epilogue. I will just add again, just to kind of end my point, and you can add anything else you want to say here. It is very ambiguous, I think, what it means at the end of this movie, which I do appreciate about any movie doing at the end of their film. But what it's being ambiguous about, I think, is something that I am skeptical of being ambiguous about that certain subject.
Yeah, and I think the Zone of Interest is a great comp because, again, we don't need, I wouldn't say that movie is like completely straightforward and direct, right? But it's clear. And so, and I think that you don't need the audience to like immediately leave with this like message that they can, verbalize right at the end of the movie, right? Like often in these epics, like in these long, movies, you have a lot of different themes and you're feeling a lot of different, right, messages that you experienced throughout this journey. But I think you're right. Like, I think the ambiguity is, especially in a movie that we know and is being marketed as like having final cut. That's where the problem comes, right? Because it's not that I need, again, a movie to tell me exactly what it's trying to say. It's just that,
even though it's been doing that in many moments throughout the film, and then conveniently not here.
Exactly. It's the not avoidance completely, but the sidestepping a lot, where it becomes like unclear. And again, so this is we saw it last night, so we're still like we'll see it again. But I think that I had a similar reaction to the different interpretations that I've seen coming out of this, of like, I actually don't think, even when I view it on a second time, though, that like I'll see this like strong, right, like thematic exploration or political exploration of what people are saying that it's about. But we'll see.
I just think we're also just kind of skeptical or dubious of period pieces that treat themselves really seriously. So we already went into this movie with a little bit of like a bias against those kinds of movies, because, and to defend ourselves a little bit here, because many period pieces, such as this epic, The Brutalist, really try to not challenge their audience to grapple with the present implications of what the movie in the past is about.
Exactly,
Instead, they treat to the history as if it's real and you're in that moment, in that part of history, because it's easier to. It's much harder to like connect the past in a contemporary world because there's a responsibility with those stakes. And I do think that this movie attempts to do that a few times, but once you step into that pool, you got to dive in. You know what I mean? Like, and because it doesn't, and instead of something like the zone of interest literally shoots you forward, is something that I find in rewatch now. I'm sure on rewatch, whenever I rewatch it, that's a tragic movie to rewatch. But when we do, I'm sure it'll be something that I look at as like very impressive and really bold, like, and big, and however this movie's being talked about, monumental. You know what I mean? Because then that actually demands a debate, you know, about those kinds of things. And Jonathan Glazer using his Oscar time to talk about those issues. And I mean, that would be great if Brady Corbet does that too. He might. And so we'll see in the future if he does that, because it seems like he might win Best Director and Best Picture here.
I got to ask you one question before we get out of here.
Yeah, because we're about to get out.
Do you think so? Adrien Brody won the Golden Globe. A lot of people hadn't seen The Brutalist. So a lot of people are like, okay, best, motion picture for Golden Globes and Adrien Brody over Timothée Chalamet, which, Timothée Chalamet is running an all-star Oscar campaign. He's about to do a double feature on SNL. But do you think, now that you've seen The Brutalist and now that more people are able to see The Brutalist, and people let us know in the comments too, I'm interested, because everyone was like, Timothée Chalamet needs to win this Oscar at playing Bob Dylan. Do you actually think that the win was more deserved for Brody?
Wow. Timothée Chalamet brought biopics back. And Adrien Brody expanded on his character from The Pianist. You know what I mean? Like, there is a level of like, I've seen this guy do this before and he's really good at it. And he also has like a personal history attached to this movie that I think is really profound. If listeners want to check that out online or watch those conversations on YouTube, and I'm sure he'll talk about it if he wins the Oscar. I think it is it's easier to play a fictional figure than it is to play a real life figure. That's why so many biopics struggle, because there's so many responsibilities or there's so many hands on that script. Yeah. And what Chalamet did to play...
And expectations, obviously, of like real life footage with Bob Dylan,
Yes. I think Chalamet actually added a sort of... self-criticism of not only himself as a celebrity, but Bob Dylan, the figure within that movie, that is supposed to be like a not necessarily like a great man myth film, but it is supposed to be like praising Bob Dylan, that biopic. But I do think he adds an element to that figure that is a little bit not scathing, but critical. That is really actually an important thing in biopics right now, because they're so sanitized. And to add to that, Bob Dylan is like this like cultural icon to so many generations of people. Not to our generation, but like certainly somebody that we're all thinking about more now, because Chalamet is such a star for people our age. So I think it's just a really important performance that is going to elevate a genre that I do think matters. So when people are like saying biopics are the worst thing that's happened to movies, I just disagree. Like, I think Malcolm X is one of the best movies ever made, and it's like a biopic. Wolf of Wall Street, one of the best movies ever made. That's a biopic. Like, those movies can have significance because they take real life figures and they add commentaries to them, and they also bring environments that are in recent memory back to life to show you how maybe history hasn't changed that much, or maybe it's even regressed in some ways, like societally we've regressed. And I think Timmy doing a service to that Bob Dylan performance to make it a little bit critical is a big deal. I'm also a Chalamet head. And so like, don't trust anything I just said. So like I
was
don't
going
mind
to say
saying
Chalamet
that.
before I saw anything.
Yeah.
But
I honestly, Adrien Brody could give the best performance of his lifetime, and I probably still would have said Chalamet. So I am not to be trusted, but I just feel like I've seen the Brody performance before, though he is excellent at doing that performance, if that makes sense. I can't see really any actors doing what Chalamet did with Bob Dylan, Cate Blanchett aside. But I feel like I can think of many actors like a Jeremy Strong or someone like that with an emotional presence and depth that could bring a level of brevity to that kind of character and gravity. In the Brutalist as László. So that's really where I come down on it. Yeah. Do I think Adrien Brody's going to win? Yes.
Okay, I'm going to save this for our Oscar predictions.
You're going to save your answer, but you put me on the spot?
Well, I was just curious. You had an answer. You could have said. But I think right now, I think I was like, I'm leaning more towards the Brody deserving this. But I can't tell. I have to like search my own bias of me also being like, well, it's because Timmy's young and he'll have other opportunities. Thing going on in my mind in terms of like these awards shows, which we're not an awards show podcast, but obviously we cover the different awards because these are usually the movies of the year that people see and get attention. So similar with actors' careers, so they're important in that aspect of like. But I think that I think Brody deserves the award more for me right now. But I have to examine if I just think that because Timmy is young. And also like we saw in the Golden Globe speech, Adrien Brody was like, I'm honored to be amongst the people who were also nominated. And he said everyone's name, but he said Timmy, right?
He said Timmy and not Timothy.
Yeah, which Timothy Chalamet has talked about, like
he's trying to get away from Timmy.
To be called Timmy because he doesn't want to be seen as this like young actor.
I noted that as well.
So that was interesting.
Trying to be like, you're a kid who still doesn't deserve it yet, even though he should have won at 21 years old for Call Me by Your Name.
What we're not saying like Adrien Brody was like actively trying to do that.
We're starting that now.
That's kind of like what he is. That's like
Adrien Brody dissed Timothy Chalamet.
Right. Maybe why people also might be like, well, Timmy, I can call him Timmy. But
Timothy.
Timothy.
Yeah,
Timothy. Might be not in the conversation.
For our Brody heads or anybody else who thinks there's other actors who we haven't mentioned, there's so many that you could bring up. In this
of course. I was
Josh O'Connor challengers. But like there's a lot of actors you could bring up for this role. But for the Adrien Brody heads, like to give you some credit here, he maybe should win just because like Chalamet's best performance isn't even in A Complete Unknown from 2024. It's Paul Atreides from Dune 2. So do you know what I mean? Like he's not even getting nominated. He's not going to get nominated for his best performance.
No, yeah.
So that's crazy. You know what I mean? It's absurd. But like maybe that's even more of a reason to give him the award because that's pretty wild.
Yeah. I mean, I understand what you're saying. We'll talk about this more on Oscars, but I just think the emotional moments of Adrien Brody in this movie were
extra credit.
Oscar worthy.
So I'll go first to give you a second to think. I'm going to go the score, which I think I said at the top, and the composer's name is Daniel Blumberg or Blumberg. I apologize if I mispronounced that. I have never heard a score from this composer. I think he's in his mid-30s, and he's a Jewish electric guitarist composer.
Okay.
And I thought the obviously the booming, again, I don't know what to call it. What did we say earlier? The anthem?
Yeah.
The subversive American anthem was really successful and impressive, but also the way that you spotted like how they toned it down throughout different parts of the music. I thought that was really wonderful. I also love the 80s tone they used for when they shoot us forward into the 80s. I thought that was really cool. So yeah, I really liked, I think without the music, this movie wouldn't hit the same. I don't even think it would get nominated for an Oscar because that trailer is doing such numbers.
Yeah.
Like the music in that trailer is wonderful. And I do think trailers like have like an editing of them, the design of them have a big impact about whether even Oscar voters watch a movie.
Yeah.
And this trailer is like one of the best of the year because of the sound.
Yeah. That's a great one. For me, I think it's just like in the writing, making Adrien Brody's character an architect. I think in a movie like this long too, it really helps. Like even in There Will Be Blood, which I love, and again I'm referencing because there's obviously PTA influences all over this movie.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's just so smart to like basically turn an oil rig into something that is beautiful to look at, like these buildings, and having these kind of sinister darker aspects, especially like at the end of the movie when we see different people in this search party for Harrison, like going through the building, where we see like flashlights going through these like beautiful like openings in the like entrance of the building. And then when they're underneath in the kind of like water room, whatever. But you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But the kind of the
foundation of the
playing
building.
with, right, the beauty and the darker undertones of the movie thematically. And also obviously it's just like just really smart in terms of making a really like long movie beautiful to look at, and also having conversations about like creative ambitions and integrity and the kind of like commodification, right, of art. Like I think that was all really interesting to incorporate into the story. So I think that deserves extra credit. And also every single time we see a road, when we're like driving down the road and we get the
I really like the camera placement on the cars, whatever they're doing. Yeah, it's really cool.
Like sped up, right? Like increased frame rate of us just like speeding down these roads.
It's sick.
Yeah.
I feel like we're in Ferrari, a Michael Mann movie.
I'm there for it every time.
What you were just describing about his journey in this film as an architect was really reminding me of Tar. And that's what this movie makes me think about. It was like Tar was really successful at a with similar commentaries with a completely different narrative. So maybe that's another rewatch for listeners at home who are looking for some more brutalist movies to watch.
Or like epic.
To get your taste of it again. All right, that was the extra credits of The Brutalist. I'm sure we'll be back talking about this movie come Oscar season. The nominations are this week.
Yeah. Well, I think they got delayed, but
that's right.
Yeah.
Yes, and we hope everybody is safe out in California. We're in Colorado. But yeah, let us know what you thought about The Brutalist in the comments. Let us know what you think about its Oscar chances. Let us know nicely what you thought about our criticism of the movie and what we appreciated about it. And we'll be back soon. See you guys.